Welcome to episode 36 of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. I'm your host, Josh Hennig. On this episode of the podcast, we're going to get into a little bit deeper of the GOAT conversation. Who's the greatest basketball player of all time, with LeBron rising up the all-time list of points, assists, and more? Also, what do other people think about the greatest of all time conversation? We'll get into that, as well as the news that came out this week about the future of the Arrow television show, how it will impact all the shows on the CW moving forward. Also, Jon Jones, another win at UFC 235, what it means for his legacy and his career moving forward. So let's open up a cold one and get started on episode 36 of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. Topic number one on episode 36 of the Mutant Blitz Podcast: LeBron James creeping up all of the all-time lists in NBA history in numerous categories. And part of it is, yes, because he's great, but also because he's played so long at this point. Remember, he did start as a teenager in the NBA. So at the age of 34, heading into Wednesday night's action, LeBron James only 12 points behind Michael Jordan on the all-time NBA scoring list. And I think it's fair to say that within the next couple of years, he will move into third and pass Kobe Bryant. He's still about 4,000 behind Karl Malone, and he's still another 6,000 behind Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. So it's not too far-fetched to say that LeBron could become the NBA's all-time leader in points scored. But just to showcase how talented LeBron is already also number 10 all-time in assists. LeBron's only going to need another 400 assists to reach 9th all-time and pass Gary Payton. And he's only going to need another 500 to get into the 9,000 category. By the way, the only people with over 10,000 career assists are Magic Johnson, Mark Jackson, Steve Nash, Jason Kidd, and John Stockton. So LeBron is in rarefied air statistically. He's in rarefied air in terms of teams. Multiple teams have won championships with, outside of Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and LeBron James, there's only a handful of guys who have won multiple championships with multiple teams who are also league MVP award winners. It's a very select group. So LeBron, we all know how great he is. We know he is in the greatest of all time conversation. The problem is that people don't seem to agree upon how they delineate the greats of all time, because one of the oddities of basketball is that when you talk about the greatest of all time, it's supposed to be an easier conversation than it is other sports. It's hard to have a conversation of who the greatest football players of all time, because the quarterback does something different than the wide receiver, and the wide receiver has an impact on the game than a defensive back. And a defensive pass rusher like a Lawrence Taylor, he's different than Jerry Rice, and Jerry Rice is different than Tom Brady. So we typically only get into conversations about who the greatest of said position is. On the flip side, in baseball, you kind of have to do the same thing. It's the greatest hitter and the greatest pitchers. We don't usually get a conversation who the greatest baseball player is, because realistically, would Babe Ruth even have been any good in the modern age? We have no idea. We don't know if Babe Ruth would have been a better baseball player, if he would have actually had a workout regimen, or maybe Babe Ruth was just the best of his era, and that being the best of your era doesn't always equal in the consistent production in future years. We're not 100% sure if Babe Ruth would have done anything he did in the 19-teens, the 1920s, and the early 1930s in today's game. So it's a little hard to delineate who really the greatest baseball player is as well. Basketball is a sport that realistically, it's a lot easier to have a conversation about who the greatest of all time is, or at least it should be, because if you are a great basketball player, you should be able to do a few different things. You should be able to score a lot. You should be able to do other aspects of the game very well. And if you are one of the best, you should be able to win league MVPs. So the conversation of Jordan versus LeBron, while it is interesting, it leaves out some candidates, because Wilt Chamberlain and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar were also dominant players, but their success came before the Jordan era. So for some people, they tend to forget about history. Then you have the other people who say, well, what about Magic Johnson? What about Larry Bird? There's a lot of names that get thrown around in this conversation. And I think part of the problem with the greatest of all time debate is that people don't appreciate what the other candidates have done. They're so hyper-focused on who they think is the greatest of all time. They don't think about who else was great and what they did. People overlook the fact that, like I said, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar won an NBA championship with 2 different franchises. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar won league MVPs 6 times. People always point to the other 6. Michael Jordan. Michael Jordan won 6 NBA championships. Well, Bill Russell won 11. So which is more valuable, 6 or 11? People put value on what supports their argument. That's why I like what Kevin Garnett told Dwayne Wade recently on NBA TV. He said that he thinks that there should be a greatest of all time of every era, that it shouldn't be just greatest of all times going against each other. And in that case, LeBron is the greatest of all time of this era. Jordan was the greatest of all time in his era. Kareem would be the greatest of all time in his era, and Wilt would be the greatest of all time of his era. So in that way, you could actually have 4 different greatest of all time if you use the Kevin Garnett rationalization. But there's a lot of people who don't like that, because at the end of the day, there's a group of people, and there's a majority of basketball fans who believe this. No matter what you tell them, it's either Michael Jordan or LeBron, and nobody can tell them otherwise, because they put so much weight on certain factors. Some people put it on, well, LeBron is the greatest talent I've ever seen play basketball. Some people put it on, well, Michael Jordan's the greatest competitor I've ever seen. Michael Jordan did things I never saw anybody else do. Now, 76ers big man Joel Embiid said this a few weeks ago, which got him in a little hot water with some people, saying that Michael Jordan isn't the greatest of all time, and he named somebody else.
He's not the GOAT. To me, you got Will Chamberlain. He has all the records, and I don't think that they're ever going to be beaten. I don't see anybody getting 100 points in the game. That's it. He's the GOAT.
While Joel Embiid isn't fully 100% correct, Wilt doesn't hold every record. There's a plenty of records Wilt doesn't own. He is right. We will never see that 100 points in a game record be broken. I do agree with Joel on that. But what gets overlooked in the whole greatest of all time conversation, despite the fact that Dennis Rodman had an expletive-filled explanation why Joel Embiid should shut up and not talk about the greatest of all time, because Dennis is an expert on basketball history, right, is the fact that people make these subjective opinions without objective information. See, these are all opinions. One man's greatest may not be somebody else's greatest. People say that Diana Taurasi is the greatest women's basketball player of all time, but yet they conveniently forget about Cheryl Miller. Part of the problem is that when it comes to basketball, people don't understand the history of the game like they do the other sports. Baseball has a whole documentary by Ken Burns that ran on PBS years ago. It's 10 parts. It tells about every decade of the game of baseball in detail. NFL has NFL Films, which has documented every great moment from every team, from every Super Bowl, and the history of the game from the 1950s and now. The NBA doesn't have their history organized in the same manner. So what's the problem? Well, part of the problem is that the NBA, their own fans, don't understand the history of the game very well. And as a result, a lot of these arguments are made by people who are only arguing on the limited information that they have. There are people who think Kareem Abdul-Jabbar is the greatest athlete to ever play in the NBA. People scoff at that, but people forget that Kareem was a guy who did track and field. Kareem is a guy who did martial arts. There's a lot of things that Kareem could do that we've never seen a big man do before. The same with Wilt. So to me, with LeBron James passing Michael Jordan, I think it's time that we just stop arguing about the greatest of all time. It's become a tired conversation. Realistically, if we're going to sit here and act like one guy is really that much better than another guy, then what we're really arguing is to be right and someone else to be wrong, which is stupid, because greatness comes in all different ways. And I think that we should start treating basketball the way we do football and baseball. We either need to say who the greatest is of their era, where Wilt was the dominant force of the 1960s, and the only reason he won more championships in his career is because Bill Russell played on the greatest team of the 1960s. Wilt only won a couple championships. Why? Because he kept running in the Bill Russell Celtics. Kareem arguably could have won more championships, but his Lakers in the 80s ran into some really great Celtic teams of the 1980s. And of course, the 1983 Sixers team that was, in my opinion, one of the first super teams we've ever seen. Michael Jordan dominated the 90s, and we really don't know how great Michael wouldn't have been if he didn't retire for 2 years and let the Rockets have a chance at winning a couple championships. And LeBron is the greatest player of his era, and realistically, we may never see one player get to 8 NBA Finals in a row ever again. Furthermore, he got to 8 NBA Finals with 2 different franchises. Who else can say that? That's an incredible accomplishment outside of all the MVPs and the championships and all the other accolades that come LeBron's way. I think we need to look at basketball with a better understanding of history. I know it's hard for a lot of people because people don't actually want to take the time to learn about the history of the game. They'd rather just go out there and play a video game and judge somebody on an NBA 2K rating because that's a lot easier to do than actually do some research. Topic number 2 on this episode of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. It's the end of an era in television. It has been announced and confirmed that the upcoming 8th season of Arrow will be the final season of the show on the CW. It's been confirmed by Stephen Amell, who plays the main character Oliver Queen. It has also been confirmed in a statement to The Hollywood Reporter by showrunner Beth Schwartz, executive producer Greg Berlanti, and consulting producer Mark Guggenheim. And this decision we knew was coming. And we knew it was coming for a couple reasons. One, because with all the new shows that have popped up on the CW, it's becoming a crowded field for the superhero genre on the CW. There was a time a couple of years ago that I would have believed, I held this belief for a while, that the CW could be to superheroes what CBS was to shows like NCIS and CSI. I felt that there was a genre, a viewership, and a type of style of programming that people were consuming in large enough quantities that realistically you could fit one person into that or one audience into the category for your network. Over the last few years, I'm noticing a pattern though when it comes to television and viewership, and I think the CW understands it as well. You see, the traditional comic book reader can read the same characters and different stories and different scenarios for decades at a time. Part of it is because when you go from the 70s to the 80s to the 90s, you'll have different people who start writing for different comics. You may like one run, you may not like the next run. So traditionally, one of the things that has made comic books something that can last as long as it is because not just because the characters are interesting, not just because the people identify with them or are fascinated by their stories and how they relate to other characters, but because of the fact that in comic books, you're not getting the same person running the same comic with the same stories decade upon decade upon decade. Spider-Man has had multiple people writing for it in Marvel Comics. Batman has had multiple people write Batman comics in the DC universe. And each writer puts their own spin on things. You don't get that same type of change up from era to era to era that you get with television. Television is much more built around a cast, an extended storyline over a series of episodes. That's why when different shows last as long as they do, whether it's a show like NCIS on CBS or a show like Seinfeld back in the 90s, it's impressive that people kept coming back for more. But it's also important for a show to know when it's run its course. And I think that's what the Arrow has figured out. They figured out that while their show launched an entire universe, it's time to let that style be put to bed. And with the introduction of Batwoman, you don't really need 2 dark vigilantes in the CW universe. What makes the CW universe unique is that every superhero show has a unique, different style. The Flash is a little more fun, a little bit more built around a family-esque unit of friends. Black Lightning is a show that has to do with certain cultural prototypes, has to do with family-oriented programming. telling a very different story than you're going to get from the other shows, because the characters in it are dealing with a different type of real-world scenario that the other shows have never addressed before. Supergirl was originally supposed to be a show for women with women central characters and casting. While the show has evolved and ebbed and flowed to and from its original intent, the viewership of the show has been created and built and solidified in many ways. DC Legends of Tomorrow, while that show has evolved as well, they've kind of gotten a breath of new life with the introduction of John Constantine onto the show, turning the show more into a cult following than an actual general audience viewership. Arrow was the show before all of them, and while Arrow launched these shows, before this season, Arrow had been dipping in ratings in terms of linear television as well as digital viewership for a while now. And it's fair to say that the show Arrow, while it did launch and it is the original of all the shows, it's kind of run its course as well in terms of really how important is the character of Arrow in the grand scheme of things. Despite the fact that the show originally tried to, in some ways, pattern vigilantism of the show based on some Batman concepts from Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight, we also know that Oliver Queen as a character and the Arrow as a vigilante is very different than Batman and Bruce Wayne. So as a result, this show was going to come to an end. There's a lot of people who felt like this season 7 would be the final season, with a new showrunner in Beth Schwartz, with the changes that have been being made at the network of shows moving time slots and moving different times, different days, and the shuffling of the lineup. I think it was going to become eventually that you were going to move on from Arrow. Now, the final season will be a reduced order of 10 episodes going to lead up to the next Crisis event. There's a lot of conjecture online that whatever Oliver Queen promised the Monitor in the previous Crisis Infinite Earths event, that deal to save the lives of Supergirl and the Flash is going to come into play in this next Crisis event. Now, I don't know for sure if Oliver Queen's going to be killed off or not, but what I do know is that the final season is going to allow us to tie up a lot of loose ends, not just in terms of the Arrow, but the entire Arrow universe. We've seen a lot of crossover go on between the Flash and the Arrow, between Argus and the Flash team at Star Labs. We've seen crossover from different Earths. We've seen time travel. We've seen a lot of different things explored on these different shows. And I think that for Stephen Amell, I think he, as an actor, has also maximized every ounce of energy he can get out of this character. I'm glad to see the CW is announcing there's a final season coming up and not just cutting off the show altogether. I think that's the best way to handle it, because when you're dealing with superheroes and when you're dealing with characters that have a certain type of audience like that, you're not dealing with a very traditional television viewer. You're not dealing with a fickle viewer who may come and go. The people who invest in a superhero television show are the same types of people who invest in shows that create cult followings, whether it was Knight Rider in the 1980s, whether it's a show like Seinfeld in the 90s, whether it's a small group of people or a large group of people, people who invest in shows deeply and have that kind of following online, on linear television, as well as social media now, it's something that you have to say, look, this is what we're doing with the show, and this is why you should keep watching. And I think the CW has done a great job of that because of the introduction of the character of Batwoman. You're going to have another vigilante-type character who in some ways can fill the void of Arrow moving on. I don't think the Arrow is going to be the only show that goes away. I think that eventually either DC Legends of Tomorrow or Supergirl will be the next to bite the dust, but for a very different reason. Supergirl has suffered in the ratings at times, and their style of storytelling with the show has alienated some of their potential viewers or past viewers who were viewing the show for one reason and left because the show did nothing for them. I think the obvious downturn of Black Lightning in the ratings is more has to do with the change of time and the change of lead-in programming than it does about the actual show. DC Legends of Tomorrow has become a little bit more outlandish, so they haven't done a good job at balancing between being goofy and being something that is legitimately watchable at times. There are some episodes of that show that make me scratch my head of why I'm still watching, honestly. I think the infusion of John Constantine has definitely helped the viewership of that show. But in the end, how many time-traveling stories can you tell? You're going to run out of scenarios eventually. Eventually, you got to stop time traveling. I think moving forward, the only show I can guarantee you that's going to stay on the CW long-term is going to be The Flash. Aside from being the highest-rated show on the CW, I think The Flash also has evolved and understood not just how to keep their audience, but to grow their audience, because the show is arguably, of all the CW shows, you could argue might be the most fan-friendly in terms of storytelling, in terms of characters, in terms of evolution of the story and character relationships. So, yes, it's time for the Arrow to come to conclusion, but it's also time for us to appreciate what this show has done. It has opened up many doors for the superhero television genre. Frankly, I'm unsure if we would have not just gotten all these shows on the CW, but I'm unsure if the Fox Gotham show would have ever happened. I'm unsure if the Netflix shows from Marvel, like Daredevil, Jessica Jones, and Luke Cage, would have ever happened. I'm unsure if Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. would have lasted as long as it has on television. All these shows, I'm unsure of their success and even their creative production if it wasn't for the Arrow television show bursting on the scene the way it did in its first 3 seasons and setting the groundwork for all these other shows, not just to pop up on the CW, but to show other networks that this is a viable television commodity. And now, as a further offshoot, because of the success of these shows, now you're seeing what's going to happen. Disney Plus comes out in 2020. There's going to be a Loki miniseries on that Disney Plus. We know that the DC Universe digital platform has its own group of shows as well, from Titans to Doom Patrol. These products would have never been made if it wasn't for the success of Arrow and the growth of the superhero genre. The combination of the success of the CW shows with the success of the billion-dollar industry, which is the Marvel Cinematic Universe, has only opened more and more opportunities for characters. And you can thank Stephen Amell, the Arrow television show, Greg Berlanti, and all the folks at the CW for that success. Again, season 8, 10-episode final season for the Arrow. It's going to be very interesting to see exactly how they tie up all the loose ends that have been a part of this show and its weave of connections to the Arrowverse over the next several months. Topic number 3 on episode 36 of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. Jon Jones wins again. That's right. At UFC 235, Jon Jones defeats Anthony Smith. Yeah, with a decision victory, but it was a dominant decision. In my perspective, he won every round decisively. And despite the fact that Jon Jones was deducted points for a strike in the 4th round that, in my opinion, was not an illegal knee, I understood why they deducted the points, and I'm glad to see it didn't factor in to the unanimous decision victory over top contender Anthony Smith. For Jon Jones, it's not just another championship defense, but it's also another win in the UFC championships as a now 24-1-1 fighter, as an MMA champion multiple times over. Jon Jones has shown that he's not just the greatest UFC light heavyweight of all time, but he is definitely in the conversation with the greatest MMA fighter of all time. Now that Jon Jones is clean, he's no longer on recreational drugs, he's no longer using any substances that are illegal under the performance-enhancing drug guidelines by the United States Anti-Doping Administration. Jon Jones actually finds himself in the same place he was a few years before. You see, Jon Jones, now 31 years old, has potentially cleared out his division again, and he's only fought twice. And that's because the UFC light heavyweight division hasn't really changed since he left. Jon Jones didn't fight for almost 2 years, and yet nobody has really risen up the UFC light heavyweight ranks to be the future of the division. You look up and down the UFC light heavyweight rankings, the number one contender is Daniel Cormier, but he's already said he's going to have one more fight at heavyweight and then he's going to retire. Jones has already beaten Alexander Gustafsson twice. Thiago Santos, he needs to worry about winning one more fight before we actually legitimately consider himself a contender, in my opinion. Not saying that Santos isn't in the conversation, but the problem with a guy like Thiago Santos is, yes, he's ranked 3rd overall in the light heavyweight rankings. The question is, who is he really beaten? He's beaten a bunch of guys who are solid fighters, but not great fighters. And in fact, the biggest name fighter that he has fought in the last several years, he lost to. That's David Branch back in 2018. Now, he is on a 4-fight winning streak, Santos, but does that really make him a number one contender? Yes, he's beaten Anthony Smith as well. That was Anthony Smith's last loss. Anthony Smith just lost to Jon Jones. You can make an argument for Thiago to be the next guy up, but that's not getting anybody really excited. What's the storyline? Here's another powerful threat to Jon Jones's crown. Corey Anderson needs to win a few more fights. Glover Teixeira's already fought for the title and lost. So is Oben St. Peru. Johnny Walker is another couple years away from being a legitimate contender as well. And honestly, I'm not even sure why Shogun Rua is still in the rankings. How on earth is that guy way past his prime 14th overall in the rankings? That's just a negative against the UFC at this point. The UFC light heavyweight division has been cleared out, and we're running out of challenges for Jones, which is why I think eventually he will move to heavyweight and try to conquer that division as well, because what Jon Jones is at this point is untouchable in terms of MMA competition. Because in order to beat Jon Jones, you have to do two things. Two things that almost nobody has been able to do to him. Number one, you got to get him out of his comfort zone. That's something that Alexander Gustafsson did to him in the very first fight. That's why that fight went to a decision. That's why it went as far as it did, because Gustafsson took the fight to Jones, got in his face, beat him up, and made Jones really question, how am I going to beat this guy? This guy is taking everything I'm throwing at him, and he's still coming at me, and he's hurting me too. It's one of the few times Jon Jones has legitimately been, hurt and bloodied in any of his championship fights. The second thing that has to be done with Jones is we need to see someone the same size as him. You see, the other thing that made Gustafsson such an interesting matchup for Jones was the fact that Gustafsson has a similar reach and a similar height as Jones. The problem for Jones is that in many fights, he is the larger athlete in the octagon. He usually has a 7.5 or more reach advantage over many of his opponents. Jon Jones is such a physical specimen, unique athlete. Remember, he has two brothers who have played in the NFL, Arthur Jones and Chandler Jones. So he comes from a family of athletes. His length, his size, and his athleticism makes him just a difficult matchup for anybody in mixed martial arts who is going to fight at 205. And whether you have a guy like Yoel Romero who wants to maybe move up the 205 from 185, or a guy like Chris Weidman, a former champion, for him to move up, outside of those kind of guys moving the 205-pound division, what value does Jon Jones have to stay at 205 moving forward? I think that he fights one or two more times at 205 and then looks to really cement his legacy of the greatest fighter of all time and go up to heavyweight. Because right now, if you ask me who the greatest fighter of all time is, it's Anderson Silva. Because Anderson Silva went on a run of championship domination that has never been seen in mixed martial arts. George St. Pierre had a great streak at 170, but he wasn't doing it in a way that you really truly believed he was untouchable. Jon Jones is much closer to Anderson Silva than GSP is, because George St. Pierre, there were many fights that you wondered, is George St. Pierre trying to win this fight, or is he trying not to get punched in the face? Or in the Johnny Hendricks fight, many people believe that Hendricks beat GSP in that fight, and GSP had already lost to Matt Serra years earlier, so it wasn't like GSP was untouched. Anderson Silva, until Chris Weidman came along, had been untouched in many of his fights. And even in the Chael Sonnen fight, we all figured that eventually Chael Sonnen would find a way to lose that fight. Not because you wanted Chael to lose the fight, but because of the fact that you just believed that Anderson Silva would find a way. That's how great Anderson Silva is. The guy finds a way. It was something incredible to watch. And then when Anderson would go up at 205 and he knocks out a guy like Forrest Griffin, a former UFC light heavyweight champion, you knew the guy was someone that many fighters just didn't want to deal with. Jon Jones is entering the Anderson Silva category, something that GSP will never do because GSP will never get the opportunity to say that he beat multiple people at multiple weight classes like Anderson Silva did. GSP had one fight at middleweight, and that was it. He walked away with a belt and never defended it, despite the fact that it was in his contract he was supposed to defend the belt. Instead, he decided to say that he had some health issues and then retire from the sport. Very convenient excuse by GSP. I think, like I said, Jones fights a couple more times at 205, and then he moves up to heavyweight, because there's a much more loaded crop of fighters for him to fight at heavyweight than there is at 205. You got Francis Ngannou, who just had that massive knockout defeat over Cain Velasquez. You have guys like Curtis Blaydes, Alexander Volkov. We don't know exactly how much longer Junior Dos Santos is going to hang around, but that would be a fascinating matchup for Jones as well. And of course, you have the former UFC heavyweight champion Stipe Miocic as well. There's a ton of fights for Jon Jones at heavyweight. And I think that's where his future is, and I think that's where Jon Jones cements his legacy. The fact that the problem with MMA history right now is the holy grail used to be, can you win a belt in multiple divisions? And there was only a handful of guys until recently who could claim that. It was legends like BJ Penn winning belts at lightweight and welterweight. It was a guy like Randy Couture winning it at light heavyweight and heavyweight. Legends of the game. Now you're seeing it's becoming almost a trendy thing for guys to do. You see that Conor McGregor won belts at 145 and 155, but McGregor hasn't fought often enough for us to really put him in any category. Is McGregor really one of the greatest of all time? I'm not really even sure. We've barely seen the guy fight in the last few years. And the last two times we've seen him fought, it was a boxing match, which he looked outclassed and outgunned, and then in a fight against Khabib Nurmagomedov for the 155-pound belt that realistically was one of the most one-sided title fights I've seen in a decade. You look at a guy like GSP that I just mentioned. George St. Pierre is arguably the greatest welterweight of all time, but he goes up to 185, has one fight, and then decides to leave the sport. What am I supposed to do with that? Daniel Cormier won the UFC heavyweight championship recently and was the UFC heavyweight champion, but people still question, is Cormier one of the greatest of all time when he couldn't even beat one man his entire career? I'm not saying that should be a negative held against Cormier. I'm just telling you what people say about him. Right now, for me, the greatest MMA fighters of all time, my list goes like this. And I know it's controversial, and I really don't care what people think, but to me, it's Anderson Silva, then it's Daniel Cormier, then it's Jon Jones, then it's George St. Pierre. Because the one thing Jones needs to do is do what Cormier did, win titles at two different weight classes. Then he surpasses Cormier. Because realistically, we overlook the fact that Cormier didn't just win titles in two different divisions, but he was finishing dudes in two different divisions. Daniel Cormier, he knocked out Stipe Miocic and submitted Derek Lewis at heavyweight. Before that, he submitted Anthony Johnson at 205. He fought Anderson Silva on short notice. He's also beaten some of the biggest names in MMA history, like MMA legend Dan Henderson. He rear naked choked him. Before he got to the UFC, on his way to winning the Strikeforce Heavyweight Grand Prix, he beat former UFC heavyweight champion Josh Barnett. He has fought some of the biggest names in MMA at heavyweight and light heavyweight has Cormier. And if Jon Jones wants to pass him for the greatest of all time conversation list, Jon has got to finish clearing out the 205 division and move up to heavyweight. Because then at heavyweight, we're going to really see what Jon Jones is capable of. we overlook the fact that Jon Jones does cut some serious weight to get down to 205. He has a lot of filling out that he can do physically. If you ever see his brother Chandler Jones, you realize how much of a freak athlete that whole family is. And can you imagine Jon Jones not cutting weight, fighting at maybe like 245 consistently? I think that's where we could be seeing the future of Jon Jones's career. And I think there's a ton of fights for him at heavyweight. Like I said, to me, the dream matchup for me is Jones versus Ngannou. But I still also would love to see Miocic fight Jones, Blades versus Jones, Junior Dos Santos versus Jones. There's a ton of fights at heavyweight that I think will be fascinating matchups, and I hope we get to see them so Jon Jones can continue to cement his legacy as not just one of the greatest of all time, but put himself in the argument for the greatest of all time. Thanks for listening to episode 36 of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. If you have any thoughts on one of the topics I brought you today on the podcast, you can drop them down in the comment section. If you enjoyed the podcast, hit that like button and subscribe so you catch each episode of the podcast as I bring you my perspectives on some of the biggest topics in sports and the comic book, movie, and television industry. I'm Josh Hennig. Thank you for listening to episode 36 of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. I'll catch you next time.